We are two poets from megalopolitan Jakarta. Old poetic traditions are but a distant past. What is Indonesian poetry is in flux. Again, in their place are hyperconnectivity and the city's chaos, triggering ever more escalating anxiety and insecurities.
In a system where the many monitor the many, where we are policed not only by the psychic brutality of the city, but also by the ever-presence of other minds, other intelligence around us, human, non-human, post-human, what if we turn it on its head by not staying in bed?
Can us poets, still partly human, often dehumanized, take over the prosthetics to surveil back the many?
We are two Jakarta poets who often use things, the thinginess of things around us as conduits to understand the fractured self.
The same things and thinginess of things now being surveilled by AI and the Internet of Things. Can us poets be AI for a day?
Or are we already cyborgs for days?
Hi, everyone. We're here today in dialogue with the poets behind Synoptic Surveillance, also your moderators for SEAPoWriMo 2022. Today we have Mikael, Johani, and Ratri Ninditya from Indonesia, and we're going to get right into the meat of our discussion. But if you're interested to know more about them, you can check out the SEAPoWriMo webpage. To start us off, Mikael and Ninin, could you share a bit more about your process of making this? What pulled you to respond in this way, and what drew you to record the scenes that we saw?
When we first talked about it, we sort of caught on to this theme of I think it was actually Ninin's idea of a synopticon of the many watching the many and being watched by the many, and so we had this idea of like turning things on its head, you know, like reclaiming the space as poets, the space that's been sort of kind of like taken over by AI or the government or society, you know, like we're being watched, and now we want to see if we can watch back, you know, the things that what we do and what other people do, and as poets, not as AI, but maybe we can be AI for a day, or and see what if there's anything different between what we see as human beings in a post-human world with what the machine sees.
Yeah, I think we also talk about how we as Jakarta poets always take external forces as our source of inspirations, or as a ways for us to understand like our feelings and understand ourselves. So yeah, and then I think the Google Earth scenes in the video would serve as like a new eye for us, seeing things, like of seeing the world around us. But it's also sort of like an illusion of now we can see everything and understand everything and then judge everyone. But do we really understand and see things? So there's like this tension between like connections and disconnections, and then freedom and confinement. And then that's sort of what fueled us as poets for our writings. That's also what we want to like convey in the video, I think. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's like, can we really buy Pop Me, you know, on our laptops?
Right. We're so disconnected from these things that we supposedly interact with every day.
Like, can we really go to a beach, you know, even though we can see the beach, but can we really, you know, feel the sand on our feet and stuff like that? And also, I think what Ninin said is also important. Like for this video, for these prompts, we also like acknowledge that we're Jakarta poets. You know, we're from Jakarta, and Indonesia is such a big country, and we're not pretending, we don't have any pretense to like represent Indonesia as a whole. So that's very important that we acknowledge that position.
I'm also really glad, Ninan, that you brought up the topic of being inspired by external forces, and it kind of brings us into kind of the next thing that I wanted to ask about, which is the poetic traditions that have become a distant past that you mentioned in the video. Can you share maybe a bit more about, you know, what you've noticed change in the scene? In what ways has it changed? What were perhaps some of the prevalent traditions, and what triggered change or disruptions to that status quo?
I think what I personally mean as traditions would be male-centric poems, and with that male gaze. So what we learned during school was always, because I don't have like higher education background in literature, but in elementary school, middle school, and high school, I only learned about male poets. There are so much more male poets than female poets, and not even queer poets. So that's like no, nada. And I think the way they portray things in their poetry is using like this masculine self-pity, where women is used like as an object and as a means for men's self-discovery. So that's what I think, what kind of like a big change now, where women, it's not like women didn't exist before, it's just that we know more, we dig more of history of women writers, we learn more about women, their works in the past, and then more and more women are getting like more exposure to the scene, and even in the mainstream scene. So I think that's one of the major change there is. I think Me Too has made a significant impact in how women are like pushed to the center and become the sort of main attention. There's also a lot of things to unpack within that tendency, of course, but that's a big change for me.
Going back to this idea of the synopticon that you brought up earlier, do you think that plays into that the tension? How have you observed the AIs and, you know, us all becoming data come into that conversation with feminism and seeing more female or maybe more queer poets as well?
I think there will be a long conversation about that, but in short, probably what surveillance, or what the thing about policing others that have made us is that sometimes discussions are polarized into just like two binaries. We fail to see like discussion, I mean, in Twitter and in Facebook and social media, we fail to see the nuances between these two binaries. Like, for example, within the women writers, usually they're like put into like this women urban writers and then women rural writers, where women urban writers are sort of reduced into this idea of neoliberal sexual empowerment, phallocentric empowerment, and then also maybe like this narration of girl bosses. But while in reality, it's not only about that, of course. And then in like talking about rural women writer, we sort of reduce that into like domestications of women, motherhood, I don't know, the mystical. So it's sort of like we fail to see nuances because the architecture of Twitter and Facebook doesn't allow us, the algorithm in everything like in Google doesn't allow us to have meaningful discussions about that.
Yeah, so while we're having, we're starting to have conversations about feminism and all of that, it's still very much steeped in capitalism, and which, kind of sometimes, loses the nuance. Thank you for sharing that. Mikael, is there anything that, you'd like to share about the poetic traditions becoming a distant past?
Yeah, I think the idea of being police is very relevant to the experience of being a poet in Indonesia. Like you always feel like you're constantly being watched, like your language is not Indonesian enough, your themes are not masculine enough, as Ninin said, like women writers are often pigeonholed into like, oh, you're just writing about domestic stuff, it's not it's not poetic enough, it's not like,
Not grand enough, not important.
So like, like the idea of being policed by AI, by the government, by other people in our society, it's like the perfect metaphor for being policed by the literary gatekeepers, and even though it's like, when you talk about traditions in Indonesia, it's a bit difficult as well to like, because as we said in the video, the tradition is always in flux, like, I mean, what is the canon is always in flux as well, like what is like, for one, like say if you like say 10 years ago, like what's considered mainstream poetry is what's published in the newspapers, but then for one poet that's published in the newspaper, there would be like thousands of poets who like who think that they suck, like we do our we do the more edgy stuff on the internet, and as well, like if you talk about like the local traditions, there are so many of them, I have no idea like how many, and so it's very hard to talk about local traditions or like Indonesian traditions, like if I guess if like the sort of like male gaze that Ninin was talking about, like I think that could be sort of like since the maybe Second World War, maybe that could be sort of grouped under sort of modernist free verse. I think that's still sort of kind of like the main sort of style that most poets sort of like work under, the older one, but the younger ones are trying to like do sort of like, I don't know, different stuff, but I mean, even in the global poetry world, modernist free verse is still sort of like the thing, we're still trying to find out a way out of it, so we're in the same doldrum sometimes.
Yeah, and I think I remember sitting in on a panel discussion that you were in a couple of years ago for Singapore's Writers Festival, where you also mentioned that actually, while many of us may think of free verse as a modernist kind of invention, in some Indonesian poetry, it's actually kind of the quote unquote traditional form, right? So I think that's really interesting, this idea of flux and kind of, that it's not a linear history either, it can kind of move, right and left and up and down and all of that. So yeah, talking about that flux a little bit more, yeah, that line in the video really stuck out to me, that Indonesian poetry is always in flux. If you could describe some of those fluctuations, what movements or developments have you observed kind of as your time is practicing poetry? It could be different topics that poets are interested in, like feminism or queer poetry, or perhaps new forms, or perhaps collectivizing and collective movement building.
Ninin's poetry book, Rusun Nothing, like a couple of years ago, got into the short list of the Kusala literary award, just like, I guess, the biggest sort of kind of like literary awards in Indonesia. And the book didn't win eventually, but the judges published a note about the winners, and they spent like more than half of the notes talking about Ninin's work, like, and they posed this question, which obviously they didn't have any answer to that. How will Indonesian poetry deal with this sort of kind of like super fast influx of contemporariness, the internet, different languages, different themes, like social media. Is Indonesian poetry ready to accommodate all those things? Like the simplest sort of kind of like example would be in terms of language. Until like, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, if you write poetry or you write anything literary, you're supposed to be writing it in bahasa Indonesia yang baik dan benar, the good and proper Indonesian. But now we see a lot more people sort of using just everyday language. Also, like maybe some people code switch. Like I think the condition for that award was that like the poetry is still written in bahasa Indonesia, but in Indian actually use a lot of code switching, a lot of English as well, and so like in my opinion, I think Indonesian poetry totally can accommodate all this stuff. It's just like does the establishment want to accommodate the stuff? Like I write some of my poetry in English, and a lot of people sort of like say that like my poetry is not Indonesian poetry, but poetry written in English. What does that mean? Yeah, so
I agree with Mike. I think one of the biggest a change I also observe is like going towards humanizing language in poetry. Like we try to use like multiple languages simultaneously. Sometimes we use like local dialects because in Indonesian language there are differences, right, between like the formal one and the informal people use every day. It's very cosmopolitan, the language actually. We don't, I don't know it. Yeah, we don't have like apa ya? In everyday language we don't have like this is Indonesian or this is English. It's just our language. So that's one of the biggest change. But also I think what's also interesting, the queer poetry also starting to use their bahasa banci in the poems. Bahasa banci is like their ways of using like how should I explain that? But it's like
queer slang, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a queer slang. Yeah. It's a queer slang historically used to, to distinguish themselves and make themselves known to other queer while not being completely come out gitu. It's also interesting. And then women talks more about their patriarchal trauma, for example. There's also like being like one of the biggest thing, alienation, living in the city within capitalism is also kind of getting more popular. Yeah.
I think the other thing about collectivizing, I think I see a tendency of under this sort of like assault of like the Internet of Things, poets are sort of like collectivizing more. They have more communities, they have more collectives, and they have sort of like little schools of poetry. They have their own style, and they sort of like teach it to other people or like popularize it to their friends. But there's this sort of like I think interesting sort of kind of like phenomenon. I think like so that now poets sort of like organize themselves in these different silos, which are so disconnected from each other, and it's very hard to actually get a hang of like like the whole trend of poetry in Indonesia, because like we sort of like sometimes don't really check each other out often enough.
Because being that disconnected, yeah.
And there's always like fights and
yeah. Sometimes I feel like within the circle I feel so free, and then I go out. Within the circle I feel, oh, we have made such progress, and then we go out and see, oh no, it's just my imagination. There's so much difference with different logics, I guess, and different aesthetics, maybe also different reasons to choose their aesthetics. Yeah. So
Yeah. I think we have a tendency to imagine community as this one unified thing where everyone's like, understands each other and there for each other and holding each other's hands. But I think the truth is a lot messier than that oftentimes. And yeah, I think that's, something that a lot, poetry communities everywhere can relate to. So thank you for sharing, what you've observed of kind of the movements that you've seen. So maybe to bring it back to your own practices for a moment, in the video you mentioned using things and the thinginess of things as a conduit to understand the self. Could you share more perhaps about your own poetic experimentations? How do things and the thinginess of things shape or influence your writing?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of like came up with that term. Obviously, it's a pun on the Internet of Things and the whole thing about being constantly connected, and we becoming data, and like we sending data to other people and receiving too many data that we don't want to. But I think Ninin already mentioned it about like I think as Jakarta poets, I think we have this tendency to not know what we feel, because it's I don't know, this city sort of is like psychically brutal, as we said in the video, and so what we tend to do, I think, is to use all these things outside of us to like we just write about things, and then it turns out that like we're actually writing about ourselves, and so I think that's why we feel like this thinginess. What is this thinginess? Like sometimes like bajai, like the Jakarta tuk tuk, I think like sometimes like what I've noticed is that like we used to have the orange bajai because it's painted orange, but like when you get into the bajai and then you look at the paint, it's not actually orange. It's actually a sort of like melange of like red, yellow, blue. It's never perfect. Rust, black, and like it's never actually orange. So why do you call it orange? And so it's like it's just the idea of orange, and and I think that's sort of like it applies to a lot of like stuff in Indonesia. Like it's like we have like like what I notice if I go to like Singapore or Malaysia, it's like the road is very smooth, So like even our roads are just the idea of a road. But
get from point to point by sheer willpower.
So, but I think that's really that's what's unique sort of about our city, is that like we live on this world of ideas. It's like double delusions, and and it's sort of kind of like maybe sometimes I feel that it's sort of my task to point that out, to write about this like that this thinginess of things is actually like a thing is not actually the thing it's supposed to be. It's an unthing, and so that's what I sort of kind of like maybe do in my poetry. Sometimes I sort of kind of call myself a coterie poet or something. Like I mention a lot of like things, names of people, of brands, of malls, of everything, but they remain sort of kind of like just ideas, and I sort of try to like I guess, workout. What does that do to live in a world of ideas and not the actual things? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I really love the bajai paint metaphor. And I think it's also an apt metaphor for, you know, our earlier conversation in communities where we try to describe movements, you know, and say that this is the abstractionist movement or the expressionist movement, or, you know, but the reality is a lot more dispersed, you know, and a lot more diverse than that. So there is also a difficulty in trying to describe these various movements and communities. How about you, Ninin? Do you have anything to add about the things and the thinginess of things?
Actually, I am one of the poets who unconsciously use things and then realize later that these things is actually me. And sometimes it's also serve as a premonition to my future. So like when I read my past poems, I feel like, oh, this is happening right now. So like, there's also like, maybe it's interesting what Mike said about the fluidity of what things and the ideas of things. I think there's also like this time dimension on that, how we view things, right? And it's interesting when we write about things and then we read that past writings and then understand that it's not only about A, but it's also about Z. And I didn't realize that before, but it's interesting to relearn and, you know, and also to read about other poets writings with things, because then you see from your perspective, but you try to, you know, try to discern what does that mean. And you're like Anya poetry for me, like Anya is Mike's wife. She just released a book, and for me it's sort of like, I think she's trying to say that the city has made such has violated her in such ways that is actually so it's kind of like, okay, to see. I cannot explain it more articulate, but yeah, there's also this this past and future things between things. That's also interesting.
Highways. Yeah, I think that about sums up the questions I had for the both of you tonight. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up, shout out?
I think maybe just that, like, we sort of kind of like wanted to make the video that we did to sort of kind of like maybe get a sort of like a more primal reaction to the video. So we sort of like want people to sort of kind of like react the way people react in reaction videos on YouTube, but also like so for them to sort of kind of like react also more primarily to the prompts, because in the past SEAPoWriMo, I was always very intrigued about the possible worlds where all these prompts come from. You know, like I remember there was the prompt from the Cambodian poets, and they introduced like sort of this I think like traditional Cambodian forms which were like in this very beautiful sing-songy sort of like form, and I sort of, you know, that's so far removed from what I am, from like the sounds and the poetry that I sort of like live with. You know, like our reality in Jakarta is much more, I don't know, grindcore instead of classical music. And so I sort of kind of like wanted to, I also wanted to know like what worlds do these other poets in Southeast Asia live in, you know? And I mean, we're so close, but we're also different. And like, I even want to know like in what what kind of room do these poets like sort of write their prompts in, and we sort of like trying to show that our worlds to the other poets in South Asia, and so that like maybe they can share their worlds in the sort of like same sort of like maybe more primal way this time. Hopefully, I mean, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, no, I love that we're given kind of a glimpse into the city and kind of all the buzzing chaos. At the same time, also talking about, all the hyperconnectivity, right? And the insane amount of information that we're bombarded with every day, So I love those two kind of similar backgrounds juxtaposed against each other. How about yourself, Nin? Is there any kind of final thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, I think it's enough.
Okay, perfect. Well,
I'm looking forward to see all the prompts.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading everyone's response as well. Then I guess with that, we'll end the recording here.